Chapter 6. Allan woke to the sound of that someone crying. For a long moment he lay inside the closet and listened to the cries. Was it a wolf? Or did wolves ever come this far into the polar regions? More likely an Arctic fox, or perhaps a bird of some kind. He didn't think the sound came from inside the cabin, but just in case his fingers closed around the handle of the carving knife. Was another bear trying to break in? He opened the closet door and looked over at the window. It was undisturbed, and now it was clear that the sounds, whimpers and sniffles and groans, were coming from the outside snow entrance to the window. The cries sounded almost human. Several times he shouted. For a moment or so there would be silence. Then the funny whimpering noises would start all over again. Finally, Allan's curiosity got the better of him. Carving knife in hand, he cautiously opened the canvas frame of the window. At first he saw nothing. Then a whimper caused him to look down. There, sitting on the floor of the snow tunnel, was a polar bear cub. Its forepaws were up and covering its head, making it look like a little white ball of fur. For a minute, Allan felt terrible. He realized immediately that the animal he killed the night before must have been the cub's mother. Tenderly, he picked up the tiny animal and brought it inside the cabin. He set the cub on the floor, and the animal began to sniff at everything in sight, as though searching for someone. It was heartrending, and Allan felt worse yet. Then the animal reached the hanging bear skin and bleated with joy. It clung to the skin, tried to lick the fur, and whimpered over and over again. Allan lifted the cub from its mother's fur. The animal weighed about 30 pounds, and Allan guessed that it was only 2 or 3 months old. He offered some biscuits, and the cub gobbled them down. Then Allan thought of the whale blubber in the ice tunnel. He hacked some pieces out of a frozen chunk, lit a fire, and thawed out the whale meat. The small animal looked like a very fat, medium-sized white dog. It was a female, so Allan decided to call her Nancy, after his girlfriend back in Aberdeen. He kept petting the animal, stroking its fur and calling it Nancy. In between pettings he fed the cub small pieces of whale meat, which Nancy gratefully chewed and swallowed. Allan was careful not to let her eat as much as she wanted, afraid that too much might make her sick. Every once in a while Nancy would run over to the hanging fur and lick it, then begin to whimper again. Allan took the skin down off the hooks and spread it on the floor. Nancy sniffed it all over. Finally she curled up on the middle of the fur and went to sleep. Allan sat down in his chair and tried to figure out what to do with his pet. Until last night he had almost stopped worrying about polar bears. He had heard that they hibernated during the winter, sleeping right through the cold months until spring came. Nancy must have been born somewhat late in the season, which was why the mother bear had been late in finding a den for the winter. She had probably wanted to get Nancy as big and strong as possible before they holed up for the cold months. But would Nancy now act as a bear and go to sleep for the winter? Or would she, without her mother to guide and protect her, follow the same sleeping habits that Allan did? If Nancy could live on biscuits and whale blubber, then Allan had no doubt that she would stay with him. But what would happen when Nancy grew into a full-sized bear? By then, with any luck, he would be off his Iceberg prison. In the meantime, he was grateful for her company, even if she did decide to sleep through the whole winter. He no longer felt the piercing misery of being completely alone. The next morning Nancy was still sleeping, and Allan decided not to bother her. He would let her wake up naturally. Crouched down in front of her, he stroked the thick fur and felt a kinship for the poor orphan, cut off from her own kind. Wasn't he an orphan himself, just as much cut off from his people? Nancy was all he had now as far as kinfolk was concerned, and he was all the poor brute had for a relative. "Aye, lass, we're in a pretty pickle, the pair of us," he said to Nancy. From now on, I'll have to be half bear and you half human if we're to get along in each other's company." In the meantime, while Nancy slept, he would get busy and fix up the cabin. The carpeting on the ceiling, he would pull that all down and use it on the floor. Beneath the floor there were tons of ice, and the carpeting would help protect his feet against the cold. It would also make it a little more comfortable for Nancy. He started to pull down the carpeting and was surprised to find, under one corner, a small trap door. The captain had other ways of getting into the hold and obviously did not need to use the trap door, and therefore did not mind it being covered with carpeting. But for a moment it made Allan angry with himself. After all that hard work to chop a hole through the ceiling, there had been a trap door. And if he had not been so lazy that first week, he would have discovered it sooner and saved himself a lot of work. He managed to get the trap door open, and it hung down by 2 hinges. Above were more barrels of whale meat, but after some hard work he got them shifted out of the way. He was now in the clear space below the keel and able to explore the length of the vessel. He made his way from one hold to the next and finally reached the hold where most of the ship's supplies had been stored. To his great joy, he discovered all kinds of useful things. There were barrels of fresh water, now turned to ice. He found plenty of coal. There were several casks of salted beef and a half barrel of salt pork, as well as several barrels of flour and a barrel of oatmeal. There was bacon, mutton, and deer meat, as well as more ship's biscuits. He found half a barrel of Scotch whiskey, along with several boxes of tobacco, a box of snuff, and a small wooden box full of clay pipes. The pipes were packed in wood shavings and were called halfpenny pipes by the sailors, since they only cost a halfpenny each. Most sailors used these pipes because they were so cheap that a sailor did not mind if he lost or broke one. The wood shavings Allan kept. When dried out, they would be very useful for starting his fire. He was able to go from the provision hold into the crew's quarters, and here he also found many things overlooked on his last visit, including an axe and a chest of tools that had belonged to the ship's carpenter. He also found several lamps and plenty of whale oil to fill them with. He found 2 stoves, one in the ship's galley and one in the forecastle, but both were too large and too heavy to move by himself. He did manage to salvage several lengths of stovepipe, which he later ran up through the hold above the cabin and out through the keel. This made his chimney work even better, and now that he had a frying pan and several copper pots from the cook's galley, he was able to cook rough and ready meals on his homemade tin box stove. One of the many useful things that Allan found was a sailor's hussif, a canvas wallet that contained several needles, spools of thread, an assortment of buttons, darning wool, and a pair of small scissors. Hussif was a nickname for housewife, and a sailor, who never had his wife along on a voyage, would jokingly call his packet of materials for making repairs on his clothing his housewife. Allan knew he would find the hussif very useful for making backpacks out of sailcloth. When spring came, he'd need them to carry his food supplies when he tried to hike out and find land. At first, Allan thought it odd that he found no bodies of his former shipmates. Then he realized that his warning cry of "Berg ahead" must have gotten them up on deck. When the Ann Forbes hit the wall of ice, anyone left below deck would surely have come up to find out what the vessel had crashed into. They must all have drowned in the sea, though he sometimes wondered, remembering the corpses the bears had found, if the body of Alex the cook, or Chips the carpenter, or even Big Tom the first mate, might not be frozen into the ice somewhere near, or even right under, the Ann Forbes. Several days passed and Nancy slept on. Sometimes she was so still that Allan could not make out her breathing, nor feel the play of her lungs, and he would fear that she had died in her sleep. But then he would place his open hand right in front of her nostrils, and always, within a minute or so, he would feel the faint warming of her breath on his palm. On the fourth day after he found Nancy, and when she still showed no signs of waking up, Allan decided to rouse her from her sleep. He was afraid that she might not yet be strong enough to survive hibernation without more food. He also wanted to see what she was like, to talk to her and watch her funny way of walking, to see the comical way she sometimes sat down. He was lonely for her company. He leaned forward and called, "Nancy, Nancy, wake up, come on, there's a good wee lassie." Allan soon found that waking Nancy was no simple matter. No matter how he called her, how he shook her, she refused to fully open her eyes. All he could get out of her were a couple of moans. Finally, he hit on a simple idea. He lit his pipe and blew tobacco smoke into her nose. Nancy gave a hearty sneeze, and Allan blew more smoke into her nostrils. Another half-dozen sneezes, and she began to wake up. At the first sign that she was coming to, Allan opened her mouth and popped a piece of whale meat between her jaws. "There, Nancy, chew on that for a while." She began to chew on the meat, and Allan fed her 4 or 5 more pieces until she was fully awake. "Feeling better?" he asked. Nancy's answer was another tremendous sneeze. Allan laughed. "That's more like it. Here, have another piece." He fed her a couple of pounds of whale meat, but again did not give her too much. When Nancy had finished eating, Allan expected her to go back to sleep, but she fooled him. Instead, she wandered around the cabin several times, sniffing at everything her little black button of a nose came in touch with. She came back to where Allan was sitting, flopped down, and began to chew on his boot. He leaned down and scratched her on the head, and her eyes closed for a moment with contentment. "Aye, lass," Allan murmured, "there's a lot to be said for being a poor dumb brute. You'll not be bothered with memories of a better life." For the next week or so, Nancy stayed awake when Allan was awake, and slept when Allan slept. Then she went into another deep sleep that lasted 3 or 4 days before Allan again woke her up to give her more whale meat. For the rest of the winter she had 3 or 4 periods of deep sleep that lasted as long as a week. But in between her hibernating periods, she only slept when Allan did, and followed him everywhere he went. She loved to wrestle with him on the floor of the cabin, and Allan often thought that if anything kept him alive, it was having Nancy to look after and to talk to. And so Allan kept busy. He had to cook his meals and clean the cabin. Weather permitting, there was his daily walk to the Iceberg mountain for a look around the area. He continued to explore as much of the ship as he could, and constantly found things that were useful. On one trip to the forecastle, he found a sort of early shotgun called a fowling piece, and some lead balls. On another trip he found a box of gunpowder. The gunpowder had been soaked in seawater, but by degrees he managed to get all of it dried out. He also found many of the tools used in whaling: harpoons, lances, cutting knives, blubber hooks, even a pedal-operated grindstone. The grinding wheel was broken, the stone having cracked in 2 when the Forbes turned upside down. Allan didn't mind that, of course. He could still sharpen his knives by hand on one of the broken halves of the stone. He scratched out a calendar on the wall of the cabin, but after a couple of weeks he gave up trying to keep track of the days. The Arctic night had already set in, and he had no way of telling night from day. Neither did he have a clock or watch. He was often unsure as to how much time had passed. He might sleep 2 hours and think he had slept 8, or sleep 10 hours and think he had slept only 2. The occasional heavy snowstorms did not bother him. In fact, he looked forward to them, as he noticed that the snow piled on the upturned bottom of the ship helped to keep the cabin warm. Sometimes, after a storm, when the fire did not draw properly, he would have to go outside and clear the blocked end of the chimney pipe of snow. Generally, though, The fierce winds blew all of the snow away from the keel of the Ann Forbes. The ship was too exposed, miles from any land mass that would help break the force of the winter winds. In fact, Allan was almost comfortable in his cabin. He found that a mixture of coal and whale blubber made a nice burning fire. And even on those bitterly cold days, when the temperature fell to 40 or 50 below zero and the fire couldn't keep the cabin warm, he could always go to bed. There, buried under layer after layer of carpeting and clothing, his body heat would be enough to keep him fairly comfortable. And when all else failed, he could always fall back on a cup of rum to ward off the cold. Nancy, of course, was not bothered by the extreme temperatures. She now had her own sleeping corner, piled high with old bedclothes, right beside Allan's closet. Allan knew that somehow he would have to get through the long winter. Then surely when spring came, and the whaling fleets returned to the Greenland fishery, a passing ship would pick up his signal, lower a boat, and pluck him off his icy prison.